When people think about World War II tanks, one machine instantly comes to mind: the German Tiger, the Soviet T-34, and the American M4 Sherman. The Sherman was not the biggest tank, it was not the heaviest, and it was not the most powerful, but it became one of the most important armored vehicles in history. During World War II, thousands of Sherman tanks crossed battlefields from North Africa to Europe, helping the Allies push back the Axis powers. But when the war ended in 1945, a huge question appeared: what happens to thousands of tanks built for the biggest war humanity had ever seen? Did America simply destroy them? Were they forgotten in military storage? Or did the Sherman continue fighting long after World War II ended? The answer is much more surprising than most people realize, because the Sherman tank did not disappear after the war. It entered a completely new chapter. Chapter 1, the end of the war and the Sherman problem. By August 1945, World War II was finally over. Germany had surrendered. Japan had surrendered. The Allied armies had won. But victory created a massive problem. The United States had produced over 50,000 Sherman tanks during the war. These machines were everywhere. They had fought across Europe, Africa, and the Pacific. But now there was no massive enemy army to fight. So what do you do with thousands of tanks? The American military had three choices: keep them, sell them, or destroy them. The reality was a mixture of all three. Many Sherman tanks were returned to military storage. Huge fields filled with unused military vehicles appeared across America and Europe. Thousands of tanks, trucks, and weapons were parked because nobody knew when another major war might happen. The military knew one thing: the next war would not look like World War II. Technology was changing. Jet aircraft were appearing. Missiles were becoming more important. And the nuclear age had begun. The Sherman, the symbol of World War II victory, was suddenly becoming outdated. Chapter 2, the Sherman's second life around the world. While America reduced its tank forces, another interesting thing happened. Sherman tanks started appearing in armies around the world. Many countries that had been destroyed by World War II needed military equipment. The United States had thousands of extra tanks. So many Sherman tanks were given or sold to American allies. Countries like France, Italy, Israel, South Korea, and many others continued using Sherman tanks. For some nations, the Sherman was not an old weapon. It was their main battle tank. France especially continued operating Sherman tanks after the war. French forces used upgraded Sherman variants during conflicts in places like Indochina. But the biggest surprise came from the Middle East. The Sherman tank would soon fight in wars that had nothing to do with World War II. Chapter 3, the Sherman tank did the birth of Israel in 1948. A new country was created, Israel. But almost immediately, Israel faced a major military conflict. The new Israeli army had a serious problem. It needed armored vehicles, but it had very limited resources. Old weapons from World War II became extremely valuable. Among them was the Sherman tank. Israel collected Sherman tanks from different sources. Some were purchased secretly. Some came from leftover military supplies. Others were captured or modified. The Sherman became one of the first important tanks of the Israeli Defense Forces. But Israel did not simply use old Shermans. They upgraded them. The tank that entered World War II in 1942 was very different from the Sherman that appeared in later conflicts. New engines were installed. Armor improvements were added, and some versions received much stronger guns. The Sherman was proving something important. A good design could survive decades with the right upgrades. Chapter 4, the Sherman meets the Cold War. After World War II, the world entered a new conflict, not a traditional war between armies, the global competition between superpowers. The Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union became rivals, and both sides prepared for a possible new war. The problem was that the battlefield had changed. New Soviet tanks like the T-44 and T-45 were more advanced than the original Sherman. The old American tank could not compete directly. So the U.S. military moved on. New tanks replaced it. Vehicles like the M46 Patton and later M60 PAM became the future of American armor. The Sherman was no longer America's frontline tank. But around the world, it was still alive. Chapter 5, the Sherman's amazing upgrades. One of the reasons the Sherman survived so long was because of its design. The original Sherman was built for mass production. It was simple, reliable, easy to repair. This was extremely valuable. A complicated tank might be powerful but difficult to maintain. The Sherman was like a dependable workhorse. Many countries modified it. Some replaced the engine, some improved the suspension, some added better armor, and some installed completely new weapons. A World War II Sherman could transform into something almost unrecognizable. The most famous upgrades happened in Israel. The Israeli army created upgraded Sherman variants that became known as Super Shermans. These tanks received powerful French guns and improved systems. A tank designed during World War II was now carrying weapons that belonged to the Cold War era. Chapter 6. Fighting in modern conflicts. The Sherman continued fighting decades after the famous battles of World War II. It saw action in conflicts such as the Korean War, the Arab-Israeli Wars, and other regional conflicts. During the Korean War, older American tanks were brought back because armored warfare returned. The terrain was difficult, the weather was brutal, and reliable vehicles were needed. The Sherman still had value. Although it was no longer the strongest tank, it could still perform missions. It could support infantry, destroy enemy positions, and provide firepower. The Sherman's greatest strength was never being the strongest tank. Its strength was being available, reliable, and adaptable. Chapter 7. The Sherman in the Korean War. When people think about the Korean War, they usually imagine a completely different conflict from World War II. That in many ways it brought old enemies and old machines back onto the battlefield. In 1915, North Korea invaded South Korea. The United Nations forces, led by the United States, needed armored vehicles immediately. At first, American forces faced a serious problem. North Korea was using Soviet-built T-34 tanks. These tanks had a powerful reputation because they had helped the Soviet Union defeat Nazi Germany. The early American tanks available in Korea struggled against them. So older American armor was brought back into service. Among them was the Sherman. The M4 Sherman had already fought one global war. Now years later, it was fighting again on the Korean Peninsula, but this time the Sherman had changed. New versions had better guns, improved armor, and upgraded systems. The most famous version used in Korea was the M4A38 Sherman, often called DZ8. This version featured improved suspension and better mobility. It was faster, smoother, and more effective than the original wartime Sherman. In Korea, the Sherman proved something important. A tank does not always need to be the newest weapon to be useful. A reliable machine with trained crews did still make a difference. Chapter 8. The Sherman's last major wars after Korea. Many people assumed the Sherman story was over, but it was not. The tank continued serving in different countries for decades. One of the most famous examples was Israel. During the Arab-Israeli Wars, upgraded Sherman tanks fought against much newer enemy tanks. In the 1956 Suez Crisis, Israeli Sherman variants saw combat. Later, during the 1967 Six-Day War, some upgraded Shermans were still in Israeli service. By this time, the battlefield had changed dramatically. Modern tanks were faster, their guns were stronger, their armor was better. But upgraded Shermans continued fighting because they were available and familiar. Israel transformed the Sherman into something almost completely different from the tank that landed in Normandy. It showed how flexible the original design was. Chapter 9. Why the Sherman survived so long. So why did the Sherman survive when many other World War II tanks disappeared? The answer was not just power, it was practicality. The Sherman was designed around three major ideas: production, reliability, maintenance. During World War II, America understood something important. A tank is not useful if you cannot build enough of them. A perfect tank that exists in small numbers may lose to thousands of reliable tanks. The Sherman was built in huge factories, parts were easier to find, the tanks could repair them quickly, crews could learn to operate them faster. This philosophy helped the Allies maintain armored forces across multiple continents. The Sherman represented American industrial power. It was not just a tank, it was a symbol of production and logistics. Chapter 10. The Sherman's reputation problem. Even though the Sherman became famous, it also became controversial. Some historians criticized the Sherman because German heavy tanks like the Tiger and Panther were technically superior in certain areas. German tanks often had thicker armor, bigger guns, more powerful designs. This created a myth that Sherman tanks were bad, but the reality was more complicated. War is not only about one tank fighting another tank. The military needs fuel, spare parts, repairs, transport, communication, infantry support, aircraft support. The Sherman was built as part of a complete system, and that system helped win the war. A Tiger tank might defeat a Sherman in a one-on-one fight, but Germany could not produce Tigers in the numbers needed to defeat Allied armies. The Sherman was not designed to fight alone, it was designed to win a war. Chapter 11. The Sherman goes from battlefield to Hollywood. After its military career ended, the Sherman found a completely different life. Entertainment. The tank became one of the most recognizable symbols of World War II. It appeared in countless documentaries, movies, and television shows. One of the most famous examples was the 2014 movie. Fury the movie showed an American Sherman tank crew during the final months of World War II. For many viewers, it introduced a new generation to the Sherman tank. The real Sherman tanks used in films and museums became historical icons. People could see the machine that once crossed battlefields in Europe. Chapter 12. Sherman tanks in museums today. Sherman tanks can be found around the world. Some are displayed in military museums, some are preserved as historical vehicles, and some are still operational. Collectors and museums maintain these tanks because they represent an important moment in history. They're reminders of the soldiers who operated them, the battles they survived, and the industrial effort behind them. Seeing a Sherman tank in person gives a different feeling. It is not just a machine. It is a piece of history, a reminder of the largest war the world had ever seen. Chapter 13. The Sherman's unexpected modern legacy. Even though the Sherman is no longer used by major armies, its influence continues. Modern tank designers learned lessons from vehicles like the Sherman. The importance of reliability, crew safety, mass production, easy maintenance. These ideas are still important today. Military technology changes constantly, but the basic problems remain. How do you build a powerful machine? How do you keep it running? How do you train people to use it? The Sherman helped answer those questions during one of history's most important conflicts. Chapter 14. The last surviving Shermans. Thousands of Sherman tanks were built. But after decades of wars, upgrades, and destruction, only a small number remain today. Some are preserved in museums. Some are owned by collectors. Some still participate in historical events. These surviving tanks allow people to experience history. They allow younger generations to understand what soldiers saw during World War II. A Sherman tank sitting quietly today once carried soldiers into battle. It crossed destroyed cities. It moved through dangerous battlefields. And it played a role in changing world history. Chapter 15, the final answer, what happened to the Sherman tank after WW2? So what happened to the Sherman tank after World War II? The answer is simple, it refused to disappear. Some were stored, some were sold, some were upgraded, some fought in new wars, some became museum pieces. But the Sherman continued its journey long after 1904. It went from being a World War II battlefield machine, to a Cold War weapon, to a historical symbol. The Sherman was never the most powerful tank ever built. It was never the most advanced. But it became one of the most important, because history is not always written by the strongest machine. Sometimes it is written by the machine that keeps moving. And for the Sherman tank, the war did not end in 1945. Its story continued for decades. This was the incredible journey of the Sherman tank after World War II. If you enjoyed this historical deep dive, subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, military history, and forgotten machines that changed the world. Because behind every weapon there is a story, and some stories are still waiting to be discovered.